Hi, everyone. Welcome back to A Pastor's Thoughts. My name is Chris Harris. A little update, I guess, to the channel. I'm no longer an actual pastor. I have moved, and that didn't have a lot to do with why I haven't had content out in a while. But moved to a new location, and here I just have my firearms business going. So I'm no longer a pastor, even though I'm still certified and all that good stuff, and pastored 2 churches for 6 years. So pray for me that God will put me in a place in a ministry to where he can use me as he wills. Until then, I'll continue to do the firearm stuff and enjoy the new place that we're in. There's just an update on that. We moved out basically in the woods to a 5 acre lot with a private stock pond, which is kind of neat. So I've been really busy lately. Well, not as busy as I guess I had been before, but busy with cleaning up some of the area, some of the property here, getting it ready for deer season, getting roads put through the property, and getting a food plot set up and a couple of feeders put out. So that's kind of where I've been for the last little bit, moved. But I have a little bit of time on my hands as far as I still need to build a shop in order for my business to get going in the way that it needs to. So I have a little bit of time. So I've done some things theological. I did a good bit of stuff on Twitter, I guess you would say. And I want to make this video today about the recent debate that was had between Warren Mcgrew and a guy named Rogue Calvinist. Now, Rogue Calvinist is a new-ish believer over the last few years, I believe, and yeah, he's a pretty good guy. He's new to the debate, though, the whole debate thing. I mean, I'm pretty new to it, but I've been around apologetics for a long time. But he's pretty new, so he had some troubles in the debate itself. The debate wasn't that great, but I'm not going to interact with the debate itself. I want to interact with Warren and his opening statement. Now, this may take more than one video. I don't want to make an extremely long one. And it feels like it might take a little while to go through. So I want to start tonight, or today. It's tonight here where it is now. But I want to start with this first one where I just interact with Warren's beginning of his opener, where he goes through the definition for total depravity. So I have it queued up here. I'm gonna let Warren speak for himself, and then I'll jump in. I'll pause it. I'll jump in and then have some interaction. In fact, there's not a lot that I'm going to play from Warren here. I have some things that I want to say, and yeah, we'll just start with that. We'll start with that. All right, so let's get into it. Let me share Warren here. All right, so this is the debate here over at Standing for Truth's channel. I don't know the guy. I think his name is Donnie. Appreciate what he does. They have a lot of debates. And we're just going to, I've fast forwarded to, this is Warren's opener of the debate. His Rogue Calvinist has given his. Again, this is not a debate review. So I'm not going to review the interaction between Rogue and Warren. I myself am just going to interact with Warren's opening statement. And tonight, we're just going to deal with the part where he talks about the definition of total depravity. All right, so let me get this going.
Thank you for moderating. And yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. I love the platform. I do. I'm not just sucking up to the moderator. Like I like it here. I think you do a good job. And I also want to thank you to Rogue Calvinist for the debate. So you can get ready to start your timer. I'm getting ready. Okay.
You're good to go.
And action. We're here debating the proposition total depravity is true. And of course, I'm taking the negative. Tonight, my objective is really straightforward. I aim to demonstrate 3 critical points regarding total depravity. 1, total depravity stands in direct contradiction to Scripture. 2, it strips its adherents of any reasonable basis for believing spiritual truths. And 3, it undermines the foundational truths of the incarnation and redemptive work of Christ. So those are going to be my 3 focuses tonight. In essence, total depravity is not only anti-biblical and anti-reason, but fundamentally anti-Christ. Thus, total depravity is opposed to truth and reason, both in the logical form as well as in the person of Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. But first, I want to define the term. R.C. Sproul once said that the doctrine of total depravity describes and defines a particular view of original sin that has its roots in the teaching of St. Augustine. Now, total depravity asserts that as a result of Adam's transgression in Eden, all of his progeny are born spiritually dead, condemned, under God's wrath, possessing his sinful nature. As Calvin and the various Reformed confessions state, our soul, our flesh, our will, and our intellect are thoroughly corrupt and naturally incapable of rightly understanding God or seeking after him. We're incapable of even disposing ourselves to such reform. So let's examine critical point 1, total depravity contradicts Scripture.
All right, so that's what I wanted to get into. Let me just remove that. We won't need that anymore. I wanted you to hear that definition that he gave. Which is a good thing to do, right? If you do a debate and you have a debate on a certain topic, it's especially when it's something like total depravity, I think the best thing to do is to start off with a definition. Like, you need to understand what you're talking about. Well, Warren, when he goes to define total depravity here, he cites a few quotes from people such as R.C. Sproul and Calvin, which I do appreciate. But he doesn't actually give a definition for total depravity, right? He just reads those quotes and then leaves the understanding of those quotes up to the listener. Now, I think that's a big problem. And the reason I do is because the quotes use terms and phrases that can be understood in differing ways. And the goal of any internal critique, which is what Warren should be doing here, right? He doesn't affirm total depravity, so he's going to have to, especially when he defines it, he needs to go within that worldview and define it in a way that that those who adhere to it, those who affirm it, would agree with. Right. So if you're the goal of that internal critique that you're doing is to have a proper understanding of what the position you are critiquing actually is. And from here, I'm not sure from what Warren has said in this opening statement so far when he talks about the definition. Right. I'm not sure that Warren understands that, or at least he hasn't made it clear in what he has said yet to show that he does. I don't think that, okay, you can read a quote, but just because you read a quote doesn't mean you understand the quote. Now, I'll give you an example of that, of something that happened over the last few years. I don't know exactly when the debate was, but in the textual, the critical textual realm of things, you have a couple of decent names. Jeff Riddle, people may know him. He stands for I think it's called the confessional text position. And you have a textual critic named Peter Gurry. Those two had a debate. It was kind of a debate. It was actually like three of them. I think it was Gurry, Riddle, and then James Snaps. But anyway, here's the point of what I'm trying to make. When it says that when I say that just quoting somebody doesn't mean you understand what the quote means. So Riddle, who is a big confessional text guy, he's like he's a Textus Receptus guy. He had read Gurry's book, and with Gurry there, Riddle gives a quote from the book, a quote that Gurry wrote, and Riddle proceeds to explain how this quote was completely wrong, and he goes through this whole thing, and then when he was done, Gurry kind of laughed, and he says, you completely misunderstood that, right? Would you like me to explain it to you? And Gurry did. Gurry explained where Riddle had gotten the quote wrong, and it totally wrecked Riddle's entire position as far as what he had thought about the quote that Gurry had written. Right? And that's just an example of saying that just because you read somebody's quote doesn't mean that you understand what the quote means. Right? And I'm not sure at this point, at least, that Warren understands what total depravity is. I know the audience shouldn't. If you didn't know anything about total depravity, you heard some words and you may have an idea of what they mean. But you just cannot quite grasp what total depravity is just from reading a quote, especially if you're new to things. Now, let's talk about the definition of total depravity just for a little bit. And again, I think it's key to understand just what it is if one You need to know what it is if you want to defend it, and you need to know what it is if you want to refute it. And while I appreciate the quotes that Warren gave, I really do, right? I do appreciate him the quotes that he gave. Like, I don't disagree with Sproul's, but I'm going to get into that here in a minute. That actually wasn't even a definition at all. The other, I'm not sure if it was an actual quote or not. I mean, I think it was a quote. I know he's talking about Calvin and the Confession. So maybe it was a, I don't have it quoted on here, but I do have the Westminster in here and what it says specifically about total inability. So we'll get to that. But while I do appreciate the quotes that Warren gave, they lack in conveying to the audience just what this doctrine is. Now, there was a book that, and I have it right here. I have all these books that I'm going to quote from, but this one is called, and boy, that's kind of bright. Anyway, The 5 Points of Calvinism by Steele, Thomas, and Quinn. It's a good little book that is meant to simply defend, define, and document the 5 points of Calvinism. Kind of a neat thing. Okay, it's not an overly academic work, which is fine, but it is a book that helped me understand just what total depravity was back when I was a bit younger. And I think I think it's on page 18, they give a fairly good understanding of the doctrine of total depravity. Now, there they tell us that total depravity and total inability are basically the same doctrine. Like, the terms are almost interchangeable. I'll agree with that. So you may hear me in this use total depravity or total inability, either one, talking about the same thing. But they go through that in this book as well. So I really like the way they begin the section on total depravity. And again, we're going to work through some theologians and define total depravity here, which I think is the best way to do this, at least in some respect. And I have a reason for like going through a bunch of different sources, because I want to show you the overall agreement of all these sources. All right, so I like the way they begin the section in this book, The 5 Points of Calvinism. They set the stage for where the doctrine is born, and that is from one's view, how it is that one views sin and its effect on human nature. Right? Now, that's not to say that the doctrine is not founded on biblical terms, because it absolutely is. In fact, not in this video, but in a coming video of this opening statement, we're going to go through the biblical support for it. It is a plethora of biblical support. But it's not to say the doctrine is not founded on biblical terms. It absolutely is. But how one views sin and its effect on humanity plays a very important role in the doctrine of total depravity. Total depravity is often misunderstood. Or maybe I should say that the total part of total depravity is often misunderstood. And the book here that I mentioned, The 5 Points of Calvinism, is helpful in this. It says this, listen. When Calvinists speak of man as being totally depraved, they mean that man's nature is corrupt, perverse, and sinful throughout. The adjective total does not mean that each sinner is as totally or completely corrupt in his actions and thoughts as it is possible for him to be. Instead, the word total is used to indicate that the whole of man's being has been affected by sin. The corruption extends to every part of man, to his body and soul. Sin has affected all, right? The totality of man's faculties, his mind, his will, etc. Now, in this corruption, that brings about man's inability to do anything spiritually good. And this is where we get Calvinists referring to man as being totally unable, or using the phrase or the term total inability. It's from this total corruption of sin. Now, the authors in this book, they point to the Westminster Confession of Faith for a clear and concise statement on this doctrine, the doctrine of total inability, which is this. Listen to the Westminster Confession. Now, I think this is going to be in line somewhat, at least, with what Warren had quoted. Man, by his fall into a state of sin, hath wholly lost all ability of will to any spiritual good accompanying salvation, so as a natural man, being altogether averse from that good and dead in sin, is not able by his own strength to convert himself or to prepare himself thereunto. That's the WCF chapter 9 and section 3. I think that's going to be key coming up in some of Warren's some of Warren's arguments later. Now, another good source, I think, I might get some flack for this, but I think Wayne Grudem's a good source. He has a very popular systematic theology. Like, if you haven't heard of Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, I don't know, you may have been under a rock for the last 20 years or whatever. But anyway, Wayne Grudem, in his very popular systematic theology, he actually refuses to use the terminology total depravity. Now, he does this for a reason that I think is perfectly fine. It's fine with me. I don't have a problem with it. But he believes that total depravity is it's too easily misunderstood. And just like the authors of the prior book that we talked about, the 5 Points of Calvinism, thought that it would be really easy to misunderstand total depravity and think that it means everyone's as bad as they can be. That's the same kind of a worry that Wayne Grudem has here as well. But he does go on to give two ways in which our corruption to sin affects us, and I think these are two key areas of total depravity. Whether you call it that or not, whether Grudem calls it that or not, this is what he's talking about. But here are those two key areas in how sin affects us. The first one is, in our natures, we totally lack spiritual good before God. Right? In other words, we have nothing in us that is worth standing before God to merit anything, right? We don't have any right standing before God. And then number two is that in our actions, we are totally unable to do spiritual good before God. I think those 2 points are very important. They were present in the prior definition that we read in the 5 Points of Calvinism book. They're present here with Grudem. Now, Grudem goes on to explain both of those aspects of how sin affects us in more detail in a systematic. But I think for us, just pulling that these are the 2 points that he picks as far as how sin affects people, that no one has a right standing before God on their own, and that all of our actions we are completely unable to do spiritual good before God. In other words, we can't do anything that's going to earn us any blessing, right? We're actually going to get it said that in that way from, I think, John Frame coming up here shortly. Do that. I think it is fine that Grudem doesn't use the term total depravity here. I agree with him that I think it can be easily misunderstood, as I think Warren here makes evident. And Grudem explains, like I said, those two aspects fairly well. Now, let me throw a more of a Calvinistic moderate, if you will, in here. Millard Erickson. I think if you've heard Leighton lately, he's mentioned Erickson a few times. Well, I had Erickson's systematic back in seminary, so I've been through it before. But let's listen to Millard Erickson define total depravity. He does that in this way. He says total depravity means that the whole of human nature, including reason, has been adversely affected by the fall. Humans in the natural state are unable to recognize and respond to divine truth. Now, going forward into Warren's arguments, this is where I think we're going to run into some problems, and this, I think, is where we'll run into problems in the definition that he gave before, the quote that he gave. He actually didn't explain anything, but he would look at the second part of what Erickson said there. Humans in their natural state are unable to recognize divine truth, right? Recognize and respond to, but we'll just take recognize first. And he would say, there it goes. Like, you can't see this divine truth when it's presented to you. But that's not what Erickson is saying here. That's not what any of these theologians are saying. Well, what is meant by humans in the natural state are unable to recognize divine truth? It doesn't mean that they can't read the words that are on the page. It doesn't mean that they can't, according to the syntax, understand the data that is meant to be given by that. Of course they can. They can know that very well. But they won't see it as something that is good and right. They won't see it as something that is true and right for them. Right? So I think Erickson's a little off here when he says that we are unable to respond to divine truth. The unregenerate always respond to divine truth, and they just do it in a negative fashion. But anyway, the not being able to recognize divine truth doesn't mean that when you look at divine truth, you see gobbledygook or something like that, right? Something that doesn't even register. Like, that's not even a word. Well, of course it is. And even the unregenerate can understand the way the words are put together and the knowledge there. We're going to see this later brought out explicitly in one of the premier Reformed theologians of the last 100+ years. Okay, so moving forward, so we've looked at Grudem, we've looked at Erickson, we looked at the Steele, Thomas, and Quinn book, 5 Points of Calvinism. Let's look at John Frame. So John Frame has a systematic. I also had that in seminary as well. And here's the thing: I have a bunch of systematic theologies. I don't know if that's the best thing to have, but I got a bunch of them. And if you're new to theology and you're looking for a systematic theology to get, I think Grudem's is pretty easy. Again, I'll probably get flack there, but it's pretty easy to read. A better one in the Reform perspective would probably be Louis Berkhoff. I think I would recommend him. He's probably my favorite. Anyway, moving forward, let's continue to define total depravity. We've been all in agreement so far as who we've looked at on these definitions and what total depravity is. Now we're going to look at John Frame. Now, John Frame comes to the same conclusions, but he takes a different route in understanding and defining total depravity. I want you to listen to what he says. And I like Frame. Because he's easy to read. I think his language is easy to read. He's a bit of a wordsmith, if you would say so. I think he is. But anyway, he has in his systematic a definition of total depravity that comes through a bit of a different route. He says this. He says Calvinists often describe the extent of sin as total depravity. That phrase catches the thrust of passages such as Genesis 6:5. But it can easily be misunderstood to suggest that man is as bad as he can be. See, even Frame sees this common misunderstanding of what total depravity is, that man is as bad as he can be. Now, he goes on to say, I think the essence of Scripture's teaching is better and best expressed in the words of Romans 8:8. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. This, he says, is what is crucial, or that is what is crucial, that those who are in the flesh cannot please God. This is what is crucial. No matter how good a person may be by common grace, no matter how high is his degree of relative goodness, no matter how much he contributes to the well-being of society, no matter how little the degree of his sin or the extent of God's common grace to him, he will always fail in this respect. He cannot please God. Those who are in the flesh, as Paul says, apart from God's saving grace, cannot do anything that deserves God's blessing. Now, I think that's a wonderful way to put the definition of total depravity. Is to stay right there in Romans 8, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. It just basically means that we have no right standing before God, and we have no way of our own inherent abilities to please God. Right? We have no way to, as the Westminster say, to either. Let me quote that again because I do like that. The man is not able by his own strength to convert himself or to prepare himself thereunto. In other words, the Westminster is saying that the totally depraved person cannot convert himself. He can't do this on his own. He can't, as Leighton and the guys might say, he can't humble himself to the point that he comes to to Christ for his salvation. Nor can he prepare himself thereunto. So he can't even prepare himself for this, and that's I think that's getting toward the old discussions with the semi-Pelagians and when they say when they talk about the preparation of himself thereunto. So anyway, so now we've had the 5 Points of Calvinism book. We've had Wayne Grudem. We've had Millard Erickson. We've had John Frame. Let me go to Louis Berkhoff now, because I think Berkhoff does us a really good favor here in defining total depravity. Now, you will notice something that you didn't hear from Warren. These guys are explaining a lot of what it means to be totally depraved. They don't just give you the sentence and then allow you to figure it out on your own. They're going to give you an understanding of what these terms mean. And I think Berkhoff does a really good job. He uses something here called apophatic theology, if you will. So he gives some negative statements on what total depravity is, and then he gives positive statements for what it is. I think that's a good way to go about defining things. And it could have helped a lot with Warren, because Berkhoff here actually denies some of the things that Warren claims is a positive of total depravity. So let's look at his definition out of his systematic theology. So Berkhoff says this: total depravity, in view of its pervasive character, inherited pollution, is called total depravity. This phrase is often misunderstood. Imagine that. We've heard that from like all these theologians, right? It's often misunderstood, and therefore calls for careful discrimination, right? Berkhoff doesn't even explain exactly how it's often misunderstood. It just says that it is. It could be in many different ways. And in fact, he gives like 4 different ways that it's misunderstood. So here he gives the negatives first. So when he's talking about total depravity, he says it does not imply this. The first thing, he says it does not imply, total depravity does not imply that every man is as thoroughly depraved as he can possibly become. Right? We've heard that before in the prior definitions. Definitely agree. Berkhoff also says this, that total depravity does not imply that the sinner has no innate knowledge of the will of God, nor a conscience that discriminates between good and evil. I think that's key to what Warren tries to say about total depravity coming up a little bit later. In fact, he laid out the points that he's going to defend here shortly, but that's pretty key, right? The second negative, the second apophaticism, if you will, that Berkhoff gives there. It does not imply, Berkhoff says, total depravity does not imply that the sinner has no innate knowledge of the will of God, nor a conscience that discriminates between good and evil. Yeah, so the unregenerate person, according to Berkhoff, can indeed know things about God. Right? He's going to go on to kind of explain, the positive aspects of it, but he's saying that this is not what it means to be totally depraved, which would be in agreement with all of the previous theologians that we've read, and all the ones that I've read, even after this. Like I've got Bavinck back there, Bavinck, however you say his name, but I think he's really good in his section where he talks about the universality of sin. Right? He gives a masterful biblical defense for that doctrine, which just is the doctrine of total depravity. But I mean, he would be in absolute agreement with what Berkhoff is saying here. So back to these negatives. So total depravity does not imply that a man is as bad as he can be. Total depravity does not imply that people can't know things about God, and that they can't know what is good and what is evil. Of course they can. Total depravity, he says, the third thing that it does not imply is that sinful man does not often admire virtuous character and actions in others. That means Berkhoff saying the unregenerate can say, hey, that's a good guy over there when you look at it from a man to man perspective. Berkhoff says, yeah, the unregenerate person can do that. Right? Total depravity does not imply that the sinful man does not often admire virtuous character and actions in others, or is incapable, right? It does not imply that the sinful man is incapable of disinterested affections and actions in his relations with his fellow men. That's a mouthful. But what Berkhoff is talking about there is that unregenerate people can do good things. Like they save cats from the tree. They can help little old ladies across the street. This can happen. Absolutely can. Right. All right. The fourth thing that Berkhoff says is not an implication of total depravity is that every unregenerate man will, in virtue of his inherent sinfulness, indulge in every form of sin. It often happens that one form excludes the other. Yeah, I don't think anyone would take issue with that. Now, positively, what does it indicate? What does total depravity indicate positively? Berkhoff says this: number one, that the inherent corruption extends to every part of man's nature. Right? It's what we've seen in all the prior definitions. The very first one from the Calvinism book was that it touches the totality of the man, so that the inherent corruption extends to every part of man's nature, to all the faculties and powers of both soul and body. And number two, that there is no spiritual good, that is, good in relation to God in the sinner at all, but only perversion. This total depravity is denied by Pelagians, Socinians, and 17th century Arminians, but is clearly taught in Scripture, and he gives his scriptural quotes there for it. Now, all of these theologians define total depravity, at least in their conclusions. Some of them get there in different ways, right? But they all define it, the conclusion of what total depravity is, in the same way. Now, keep this in mind as we get into Warren's 3 points in his opener, as we move forward in the next set of videos. They all also see the problem that is these theologians, when they define total depravity, they all also see the problem that can quickly come about by those who aren't or haven't encountered this doctrine before. Mainly that they would think the doctrine means that people are as bad as they can be. So it'd be like we're all little Hitlers or something like that, which every theologian denounced that. I think Berghoff went a lot farther with the negative, the negatives of the apophatic theology concerning total depravity, like concerning total depravity, saying what it does not mean. And I think we need to remember that going forward. It's going to be very, very important. But all these theologians agree that, I think, as Grudem put it in his 2-part aspects of how sin affects the man, is that our natures are totally lacking spiritual good before God. Like, we have nothing to present to God of our that's inherent to us that is worth God saying, yeah, that's pretty good stuff. So that's the first aspect of I think that all these theologians agree with. And the second aspect is that in our actions, and I think Grudem put it well, in our actions, we are totally unable to do spiritual good before God. Again, this means that whatever we do, apart from regeneration, if you will, or prevenient grace for the Arminian, it will not be counted good as God, good before God. Right? Those two things. We don't have anything that is us inherently that we can stand before God and it be some spiritual good. We also can't do anything that would earn some kind of blessing before God, I think, as Frame would put it. But the key is that we can, those are the two key aspects of what total depravity means. Now, the story, I can give you a story. I can give you an analogy. I know. At least some of you coming from Leighton's channels, his channel, you'd appreciate an analogy to explain this that maybe will bring some clarity to it if you weren't clear on what total depravity is. Yeah, I think I can give you an analogy that'll help. Now, think about you have a man named Joe who is an unbeliever, and then you have another man, and you have God. All right, so this other man, doesn't matter what his name is, he watches Joe his entire life. God, again, or God too, along with the other man, watches Joe through his entire life. Now, Joe is this unbeliever, is living his life as an unbeliever lives it. Now, all the things that Joe does, the man has a book that he keeps an account of Joe's actions. God keeps an account of Joe's actions as well. When Joe does things that are good, the man writes down the good things he does. When Joe does things that are bad, the man writes down bad things that Joe does. So when Joe goes and saves a kitten out of a tree, the man gives him a good check. When Joe helps a little old lady across the street, the man gives Joe a good check. Now, here's the key difference to understand if you're going to understand total depravity. God, as Joe does those things that the man considered to be good, he saved the kitten out of the tree, he helped the little old lady across the street. From God's perspective, Joe gets no check to the good, right? And this is the key difference. Now, technically, I think the best way to explain this is through understanding the man that is keeping the book on Joe. He would be considered the horizontal view of man's actions, right? Horizontal would mean how it is that man views man, right? We're on the same plane, horizontal. And God keeping a book on Joe would be considered the vertical understanding of man's actions, right? So you can have a single action that is seen in different ways from the vertical as it is from the horizontal. And this is understanding total depravity, so that you can make sense of how you see things in the world. Because a lot of people say, well, I see a bunch of unbelievers out there doing some really good stuff. Well, sure. And just as it was explained in the definitions that we looked at earlier, unbelievers can do good things, right? They know what's good and what's wrong. They can look at people that are doing good things and say they're good. They can look at people who are doing evil things and say it's evil. But understanding the distinction between the horizontal and the vertical, I think is very important in understanding what total depravity is. Right? Now, you might ask, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is just that the definition of total depravity. Remember the two key features, right? That first, man has nothing inherent in himself that gives him a right standing before God. There is no spiritual goodness. All right, I'm going to continue without the camera. Sorry about that, everyone. My camera, I don't know if it tore up or not. We'll just have to see, I guess, a little bit later. Yeah, but I apologize for not being able to see me and having to look at a picture now. Look, that beard's a whole lot thicker. my beard was a lot thicker a minute ago. Well, a few minutes ago anyway. And yeah, so let's finish this out. Okay, so the two things we remember. Man, I wish I remember exactly where I was. I had a bit of a problem with the camera. All right, so we were talking about, or I was talking about the differences between the horizontal and the vertical, how it is that man views man and how it is that God views man. And understanding that difference, the distinction between the two, is key to understanding total depravity, right? Because remember, the two key aspects of the doctrine is that man has nothing to offer in and of himself, that in our natures, we totally lack spiritual good before God. We can't stand before God and show him anything about ourselves that is good and righteous. And all of our actions are totally in all of our actions, we are totally unable to do spiritual good before God. So Joe saving a kitten out of the tree, or Joe helping a little old lady across the street, has no value in and of itself to get a nod or to get a blessing from God. It may be good when we look at it, and it is good, right? It's fine for us to say these unbelievers do good things. That's not the issue. The issue is with they have that what they do is not something that God sees as pleasing. And again, it's because they can't do anything that pleases God. Now, how would that be the case? Like, how can someone help a little old lady across the street, or how can someone save a kitten out of a tree and that not please God? Well, motive has a lot to do with it. Your heart has a lot to do with it. So yeah, and this is the point that these theologians have made when they defined total depravity, understanding those two key aspects. We saw that throughout the entire range of all the theologians that we looked at, that those are the two key aspects of total depravity. Now, and I do want to stress before I close this out. Well, I'm not going to close this out yet. There's a few other things I want to say. Man, this is going to be too long. I try to do this short. It's just I just keep going, don't I? Yeah. So as we continue on, understanding that distinction and understanding those two key areas is very important. Now, Warren goes on, or you heard him within the video when we listened to it. He quoted from R.C. Sproul, and he said Sproul says this of total depravity: the doctrine of total depravity describes and defines a particular view of original sin that has its roots in the teaching of St. Augustine. Now, I found that kind of weird, and the reason I found that weird is because Warren was trying to define total depravity, like I've done already through a ton of different theologians. And I'm not saying that defining total depravity should take as long as I took, but I wanted to show a wide variety and a bunch of different theologians and what they said to show the agreement that they have, and that the conclusions that they draw are actually very, very simple. Right, that total depravity just means that the entirety of man has nothing to offer before God in the spiritual goodness, and all of the actions that come from man has no ability to put any righteousness before God for any kind of credit. Right, and that's what it means to be totally depraved. So if your actions can put some kind of credit before God, like if you can say, well, I muster up my own faith, that seems to be an action that you're doing, right? It goes against total depravity. And again, I haven't started with the biblical defense of it yet, but it's there. Believe me, it is, and we will get into that later. But anyway, what I found interesting about Oh, my screen kept getting bigger there. Sorry. All right. So what I found interesting about Warren in this quote from Sproul is that Sproul, while Warren was trying to define total depravity, Sproul was not defining total depravity in this this quote that he gave. In fact, he was just setting up his definition that was coming. Now, perhaps it's the case that Warren thinks here that he's setting up his setting up the stage for a definition that he's going to get to that he really doesn't. But my guess as to what Warren was doing, rather than like Sproul trying to set up his definition, because right after Sproul said that, he gets into what total depravity isn't and what it is. I think it would have been more helpful if Warren would have brought that out. But my guess on what Warren is doing there is he's taking a dig at Augustine, right? Because right there at the end, it's a particular view of original sin that has its roots in the teachings of St. Augustine. I think he's taking a dig at Augustine. Being as he so dislikes Augustinian anthropology, that for him, right, for Warren, just by total depravity being associated with Augustine, it would cause him to reject it, right? Okay, but I digress. Warren goes on to say that total depravity asserts that as a result of Adam's transgression in Eden, all of his progeny are born spiritually dead, condemned under God's wrath, possessing a sinful nature. Okay, I don't have a big problem with that statement, right? Let's break it down again. Warren just read this. Is all he did. So all he did was read that little quote from Sproul. Then he read this, and then he said something, which I don't know if I have it written down here, but he said some other little thing that was supposed to be similar to Calvin and the Reformed Confessions or something. But I've already read the confession, the Westminster Confession 9:3, which I think states total inability in a concise fashion. Again, but you still have to understand what it's saying. So let's look at this statement that Warren made and break it down. That Warren quoted, he didn't make it. It says, total depravity asserts that as a result of Adam's transgression in Eden, all of his progeny are born spiritually dead. Yes, we can agree with that. Now, we would need to understand what you mean by spiritually dead. I don't know what Warren means. He doesn't know what the viewer means. He doesn't help us understand it in his definition at all. Like he could have read any of the theologians that I gave, especially the one out of the 5 Points book or the Burkhoff, which give you an understanding of what these things mean. He just gives you that and expects you to figure out what it is, right? Okay, you take your idea of what it means to be spiritually dead, and then you go from there. Well, the problem again is from the get-go. What did I say? If you want to do an internal critique, you need to know what the system that you are critiquing understands on these things. So if you don't understand what it means to be born spiritually dead according to the Calvinists, then how do you understand what they mean by total depravity here when they use that all of Adam's progeny are born spiritually dead? They're born condemned, and they're under God's wrath, possessing a sinful nature. Now, what is a sinful nature? What does that mean? Right? What does it mean for the Calvinists? How does that play out? Now, what Warren does here is he instead of defining total depravity in a way that makes it I don't want to say fair. I mean, it just gives you an understanding that's proper according to the Reformed confessions or to Calvinists or Reformed theologians. They don't even have to be Reformed. I don't know if Erickson is, but I mean, Erickson had a pretty he had a definition that was right in line with everyone else. But what Warren has done here is he's read a couple of quotes rather than define exactly what total depravity is according to the Calvinists. And now he's going to go on to make some arguments in 3 different areas where he's going to assume his own understandings when it comes to these definitions of what it means. He did read something I think was very similar to what Erickson said earlier, and it was this: total depravity means that the whole of human nature, including reason, which I think he was pretty pointed on that, has been adversely affected by the fall. Humans in the natural state are unable to recognize and respond to divine truth. Now, I've already picked on that. But he's going to have his own understanding of what that means rather than what is meant by the theologians who coined these or who wrote these words. He takes a totally different understanding. And I did a video about this before, and he actually responded to it, but in a way that was mocking, didn't take it serious. But I've read a bunch of theologians today in this video that actually agree with me. Right? Even John Frame agrees that there are good things that people can do. They can understand things. They can be productive in society. They can have a rational thought. They can be intelligent. They can read the Bible and they can understand the syntax. They can know the information the Bible is reading. Like they can read about the crucifixion and know that the Bible is telling them that Jesus Christ was crucified and that he rose again. Right? They just won't believe it. That's a lot different than saying, how can you trust that your mind knows anything spiritual if your mind was born spiritually corrupt? Well, that doesn't take your rational thought process away. It doesn't reduce your faculty psychology to nothing. Your intellect is still performing, right? It's just being told that what you're reading, while that's the claim, it's not for you. Right. And that's the idea of sin. Sin's like, sure, you can read that, you can understand it, but you're not going to see it as a good thing for you. That's what total depravity is, right? That's exactly what it is. So rather than, though, defining total depravity in a proper way, he wants to gloss over the doctrine as though it's just this one little thing and then take his own kind of warped understanding of what it is and run with it to make some god-awful arguments, which we'll get into later in another episode. I've got this way too long already, like an hour. There's no way this should take an hour. But, that's me sometimes. I get to talking and I won't quit. All right, so if you have any questions about this, put them in the comments. Put them in the comments or hit me up on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. My name over there is, if you don't know, it's just Chris Harris, at Pastor Chris H, I think is, I think it's at Pastor Chris H is how I've got it over there. But you can hit me up over there. I'd be glad to talk to you about it or answer any of your questions if you have a problem. And like I said, if you need a recommendation for a book, systematic theology to start with, I think systematic theology is fine. A lot of people say systematic theology is terrible. They want to point you to biblical theology, but I'm of the type that thinks that biblical theology and systematic theology have to go together. Like in order to bring out systematic theology, you have to have biblical theology base, undergirding it, if it will. You can't do one without the other. They just go hand in hand. In fact, about 300 years ago or so, they were considered the same thing. This whole debate is just, in my opinion, is pretty dumb. But anywho, if you need like I said, if you need a recommendation of a systematic theology, I think Louis Berkhoff is good, or just get Grudem. Whatever. Just don't fall into some of the weird things that he says, and read some stuff with discernment. If you're a spirit-filled believer, I think that'll help. I mean, I think that that's something that you can do. And again, I'll try to get another thing wrapped up. I may have to get a new camera. I don't know what happened with this. It like just stopped and then had a big green blob in the middle of the screen there. And this was not a cheap camera. So, yay. I didn't want to buy anything else, but it looks like I may be getting a new camera. Anyway, I appreciate you listening if you lasted this long. And if you haven't done so, subscribe to the channel, like it, share it. It's tiny. It's hardly anyone knows about it. A few friends, and that's about it. And if you have any other questions, you can hit me up here in the comments, like I said, or at X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, or you can email me at harrisarms@yahoo.com. You can email me at harrisarms@yahoo.com. And thank you for stopping in and listening. And goodbye.